What happens when the federal government bypasses a state's authority and deploys Marines onto its own streets? In this episode, we unravel a volatile flashpoint in Los Angeles and the power struggle it triggered between California and Washington. Civil unrest, ICE raids, and a federal response so aggressive it's rattling both legal norms and market assumptions. Stick with us as we decode what this really means for investors and why one smart move might be to lean into the chaos.
Okay, let's unpack this. We're diving deep into a specific, pretty intense moment. Civil unrest in Los Angeles.
Yeah, it really flared up, didn't it, following those significant ICE raids?
Exactly. And we've got your sources here, articles, reports, some notes you pulled. They give us a real snapshot of this whole thing playing out.
A very focused look.
So our mission today, pretty straightforward. Take all this info, boil it down, pull out the key pieces, the main insights, so you can get a clear picture of what went down and why it matters quickly.
And these sources, they really highlight the scale of the federal response that came after the unrest.
And the controversy too, right?
Oh, definitely. Significant controversy around it. It's a complex situation. Quite unusual, actually, in how it was handled.
Okay. So let's just dive right in then. Where does it start?
Well, the documents you got, they point to the unrest kicking off right after those ICE raids. Specific dates mentioned are June 6th and 7th across LA County.
And immediately protests.
Immediately. Large public protests sprang up, basically in direct response to those raids.
Okay, so protests start, and the federal reaction, according to this material, was fast.
Substantial.
Both. Swift and substantial. It shows President Trump authorizing thousands of National Guard troops being deployed.
Right, but this wasn't the usual state call-up, was it?
No, and that's a crucial detail these sources really emphasize. They were federalized, under Title X authority.
Title X. So that means federal control, not the governor's call.
Exactly. Bypasses state command, puts them directly under federal control. Big difference.
And it wasn't just the Guard either. I'm seeing mentions here of active duty military.
That's right. The material points to 700 active duty Marines from the 2nd Battalion, 7th Marines out of Camp Pendleton.
Wow. So active duty Marines alongside federalized Guard, that's a significant presence?
It is. And the Guard numbers grew too. There was an additional authorization bringing the total Guard deployment to over 4,000, plus those 700 Marines. Okay, so a massive federal footprint. And what were the protests like that prompted this level of response? The sources mention.
Yeah, they indicate overnight protests got pretty intense. Vehicle fires are mentioned, significant vandalism. Specifically calls out 6 Waymo driverless cars being torched.
The self-driving taxis. Ouch.
Yep. And arrests too, quite a few. The numbers reported in the material range looks like between 39 and 56 arrests.
Okay, now this is where, based on the info you provided, things get really interesting. That federal deployment under Title X, that didn't sit well with California.
No, it absolutely did not. Triggered sharp backlash. Your sources clearly state California filed a lawsuit.
A lawsuit? On what grounds?
Claiming the deployment itself was unconstitutional, that it infringed on sort of the standard procedures for using Title X. They pushed back hard.
And state officials were vocal.
Very. The governor, Newsom, and Representative Bass are quoted, using strong language, calling it a manufactured crisis.
Manufactured crisis.
Right.
Wow.
Yeah, and a test case. Even raising concerns, that it might be a step towards potential martial law.
So California saw it as a major overreach, a threat to state sovereignty, maybe even misuse of the military.
That's clearly the perspective coming from the state side in these documents.
Okay, so on the federal side then, what was the justification for this scale of response using Title X, according to the documents you shared?
Well, the material cites DHS Secretary Noem. The justification given was basically the protection of law enforcement. That was the line.
Protection of law enforcement.
But crucially, the White House framing, they specifically called the LA unrest an insurrection.
An insurrection. That word carries a lot of weight legally and politically.
It certainly does. And they use that framing, according to the sources, to justify employing what they termed extraordinary authority.
Using insurrection sounds like it's deliberately chosen to unlock certain federal powers. Okay, let's broaden out. The material identifies wider implications here, right? This wasn't just about LA streets, it had ripple effects.
Absolutely. The documents spent a good amount of time on the market and policy implications. Big one highlighted is what they call federal overreach risk.
Meaning?
Meaning using the Guard and Marines like this, federalized under Title 10 without state approval. It sets a precedent, a risky one, the material suggests.
Risky how? For markets?
Yeah, it suggests markets might start having to factor in, rising political instability, the potential for more clashes like this, more federal interventions, repricing risk.
That makes sense. If this becomes a pattern, it changes the whole risk calculation for businesses, for investors.
Definitely. And tied to that is the state-federal collision aspect, that lawsuit, California versus Trump.
Right, you mentioned the lawsuit.
The sources see that as potentially becoming a really significant civil-military conflict playing out in the courts.
And that legal battle itself creates uncertainty.
Huge uncertainty. Could drag on, shake investor confidence. The documents even suggest it could put specific pressure on, like, civil defense stocks.
Yeah.
Companies in that space.
And beyond the legal and political stuff, the material mentions clear business impacts, too. I mean, burning driverless cars is pretty direct.
Right. They talk about brand and business risk. The unrest directly threatened operations, especially for logistics, ports, transport.
And tech, obviously, with Waymo.
And tech, yeah. They point to potentially higher insurance costs down the line, disruptions to supply chains, and just the public image, the sentiment towards businesses operating in cities facing this kind of unrest.
And this all feeds into something else. The material flags a political risk premium, especially looking ahead to future elections like 2026 mentioned here.
Exactly. An approach like this kind of heavy-handed federal enforcement described in the documents, it could definitely shift voter sentiment.
How so?
Well, it suggests it might energize civil rights groups, activism, but it also introduces policy uncertainty on immigration, maybe police reform, infrastructure spending. Who knows? It just adds volatility that investors have to watch.
Okay, so lots of risk, lots of uncertainty, but interestingly, your sources also lay out a contrarian investor take, which got my eye. Because the obvious reaction might be to just sell anything exposed to California, right? Or cities facing unrest.
That's the standard playbook, yeah. Run from the disruption. But this contrarian view presented is basically buy the dip. Buy on oversold weakness, as they put it.
Buy what, though? What opportunities do they see?
Well, they'd see opportunities directly linked to the federal response itself and the kind of environment it creates.
Like defense contractors, if the feds are deploying more.
Precisely. Defense stocks. Firms that support these large-scale federal deployments, especially Guard under Title 10. Companies involved in security tech surveillance systems.
Because federal actions like this trigger spending there.
That's the logic presented, yes. Federal action drives demand in those specific sectors.
Any other sectors mentioned in this contrarian view?
Yeah, the material mentions insurance providers, specifically those covering public entities or event risk. The idea is they might see premiums go up, basically pricing in this new level of political and legal risk.
Okay.
And it also touches on transport and utilities. It acknowledges the short-term hit, like the disruption at the Port of LA is real.
Right.
But it suggests that for investors looking long-term, some of those distressed stocks in, say, asset-heavy transport could actually be an opportunity. If they rebound on broader global growth, you got in cheap.
Finding opportunity in the chaos. But there was another point, a second-order insight, the material called it, that felt bigger, beyond just investing.
Yes, that's a really crucial point they make. It connects right back to that core issue. The Title 10 deployment without state consent.
What's the insight?
The material argues that this specific case, doing it this way, significantly weakens state Guard autonomy. Fundamentally.
Weakens state control over their own Guard.
Essentially, yes. It sets a precedent, they argue, for future federal dispersal of state forces. It effectively tilts U.S. tactical doctrine more towards centralization, away from state control.
Wow. Okay, so this isn't just about one incident in LA. It's potentially signaling a deeper shift in how federal and state power works in domestic security situations.
That's the long-term implication the material puts forward.
And did they tie that back to investing too?
They did, suggesting that investors in things like private military tech, secure communications, surveillance, they could be the winners if this centralization trend actually plays out.
Because a more centralized federal approach would rely more on those kinds of services.
That's the connection the material makes, yeah. A shift in operational philosophy benefits the industries providing the tools for it.
Okay, so based on all this, the material gives some actionable outlook points, things for you, the listener, to keep an eye on.
Yes, absolutely. Key things to monitor. First, obviously, the lawsuit. Keep a close eye on the legal filings, the status of California's challenge.
Because court rulings could really shift things.
Big time. Could reset the power dynamic between states and the federal government. Markets would definitely react to any major rulings.
Makes sense. What else?
Tracking the deployment scale itself. The material mentions a possibility of it going above 5,000 troops. If that happened, it signals continued federal escalation. Investor sentiment would likely sour further.
Okay.
And then as we discussed, the material suggests considering tactical long positions in defense, security tech, military communication stocks, based on the trends identified.
And on the flip side, watching costs.
Right. Analyzing rising costs in urban areas, things like last mile delivery, urban transport, insurance premiums. The material even suggests maybe considering some short-term hedging like covered calls against that kind of volatility.
Hedging against the disruption.
Yeah. And finally, watching policy. Any pushback in Congress, any moves towards legislation related to martial law powers, even, these could be major catalysts for market swings, even hitting things like state bonds or municipal markets.
Okay, quite a bit to track there. So let's try and quickly recap the layers we've peeled back here, all coming directly from the sources you shared.
Sound good.
We started with that initial unrest in LA, sparked by the ICE raids.
Which then triggered that really large-scale federal response. Over 4,000 National Guard, 700 Marines, and crucially, federalized under Title X.
Right, and that specific federalization, bypassing the state, that's what sparked the big legal fight with California.
Yep. California called it a manufactured crisis, disputed the authority, while the federal side justified it by framing the whole thing as an insurrection requiring protection for law enforcement.
Then we looked at the wider ripples highlighted in the material.
Yeah, the risk of federal overreach setting a bad precedent, the state-federal tensions playing out in court,
The direct business risks, like we saw with Waymo, hitting tech, transport.
and that added layer of political risk, casting a shadow over future elections like 2026.
And we also touched on that interesting contrarian investor view presented in the sources.
Right, looking past the immediate chaos to find potential opportunities. In defense, maybe transport, areas benefiting from or eventually recovering from this federal response.
So this deep dive really, it pulled out those key threads, those perspectives, straight from the source material you provided to give you a clearer picture of this complex event and its potential fallout.
And maybe just to leave you with one final thought, drawing from that material, consider that second-order insight we talked about.
The weakening of state guard autonomy.
Exactly. How could this specific instance, deploying federalized forces under Title X without state consent, in this way, how could that potentially erode state control over their own guards in the long run? Could it really be pushing U.S. tactical doctrine towards more centralization?
It's a really fundamental question the material raises, isn't it? About the future balance of power right here in domestic security within the U.S.
Definitely something to mull over.
Something to think about as you see how these situations unfold or read the next headline about military deployment inside the country.
If you found value in this breakdown, don't forget to like, subscribe, and follow Market Mind for more of the kind of insight the mainstream won't give you. We go deeper, think sharper, and always stay 2 steps ahead of the noise. Remember, in a market driven by headlines, conviction beats consensus. Stay contrarian. Stay tuned.